This is a Pegatron graphics card that I paid only $3 for. Now, I don't know if you know anything about this company, but it seems like they've had a controversial history. But today, we're going to be taking a look at their 6450 and overclocking it as far as possible to see if it can still hold up. Spoiler alert, but the card ends up dying. It's an interesting journey. I first came across this card a few months back when I bought a lot of 10 GPUs for $30.
The card is absolutely filthy.
At the time, I had no idea what this card was, but based on the size of the cooler, I knew that it wouldn't be good. So I googled the model number and learned that it was made by Pegatron, a Taiwanese electronics manufacturing company best known for making iPhones and mistreating workers. I've never heard of them before, and it doesn't seem like their consumer electronics have a large North American presence. But I was able to find their 3070 on Tech PowerUp, along with the 7570 and a GTX 970, so they seemed reputable enough. But my card was not in a good condition, so before overclocking the fuck out of it, I needed to clean it out. This card is in a pretty rough shape. You can't really see it on camera, but it has the most disgusting HDMI port I've ever seen. The heatsink's not in the best condition, and based on it overall, I don't think it's ever had its thermal paste replaced. So before we get into testing, I'm gonna clean it out. The 6450 is an AMD card that came out 13 years ago and was never intended for gaming. It was an entry-level installment in the HD 6000 series based on the Terascale 2 architecture. It has 370 million transistors based on the 40nm process, which makes up its Keiko's GPU of the Jubinator variant. That's an interesting name, but the rest of the card is just about as bad as you'd expect. It has 4 render output units, 8 texture mapping units, 160 shaders, a core clock of 625 MHz, 1 gig of GDDR3 memory with the 64-bit bus, and a memory clock of 800 MHz. Yeah, it doesn't have a lot to work with, but at least it supports DirectX 11, so it can still start a lot of modern games.
What the why is this thing not, is it soldered on? Why, what the oh, there's a screw. Who the heck puts a screw on top of the HDMI port? That's so goofy.
Now, apart from board manufacturers, AMD had a few different versions of this card. They had one that had a half gig of VRAM running at 533 MHz, and another version with a half, full, or 2 gigs of VRAM running at 800. Our card falls into the latter variants, but it's still kind of unique since it has a VGA connector, which from what I've seen online, mostly just shipped on the cards with the slower memory clock speeds. So, except for the 2GB version, our card seems to be the best of both worlds, although that's not saying much.
Well, that's pretty disgusting. I'm gonna go run under some water and clean it out.
Now, it didn't take very long to clean the card out. It has a TDP of 18 watts, and its cooler, to put it nicely, is pathetic. Cleaning it out didn't take long at all, and shortly after, I threw it into the test bench system to begin the abuse.
We're gonna be using some good old Arctic MX4 thermal paste. It's pretty decent stuff, and this card does not deserve it at all. Alright, I think I'm using the wrong screw. It doesn't fit in there, but honestly, I don't really care. Alright, and the card's all back together. Let's throw it into the test bench system. The test system we're gonna be using has an i3-4130, 16GB of RAM, and Windows 7 running on an unbranded SSD. The installation's pretty easy. You just gotta flip it around, stick it in the PCIe lane, and there we go.
Next, I installed the drivers, restarted the system, and luckily, the card was still working. Overclocking went easier than expected, but didn't make a considerable difference in performance. Initially, I tried the AMD GPU clock tool, but it doesn't support this card, so I ended up using MSI Afterburner, which was basically just me dragging the sliders all the way to the right. Surprisingly, it was stable, so I decided to keep these settings and hopped into a few games. Also, subscribe and leave a like, because it genuinely helps me out. Thanks. I wanted to start off by testing a semi-realistic use case for this card and tried out Left 4 Dead 2. The game came out in 2009, 2 years before the 6450 did, and I think it's safe to assume that some people legitimately played the game with this card. I ended up running it in 1080p with the low settings and it got an average frame rate of 55. And before you get your hopes up, this was the best performing test I ran on this card, and it didn't last very long. So I wanted to see if it could run a game with the high settings, so I hopped into some Half-Life 2. Honestly, it didn't perform as well as I expected it to. I maxed out the graphics quality, threw the resolution into 1080p, and it only got 35 FPS. Considering how old the game is and that it came out in 2004, I was pretty disappointed with these results. I mean, running any game with the high settings on a 6450 is probably a bad idea, but I hope that it would at least have hit the 60 FPS mark. The next game I played was CSGO, which, as expected, ran even worse. I got a little overambitious with my expectations, and in 1080p with the low settings only got about 20 to 30 FPS. There was a lot of screen tearing, and it was nowhere near what I'd call a competitive experience. But in 720p, it performed a lot better. The frame rate just about doubled in this lower resolution and ended up getting between 45 and 60 FPS. and dare I say it was playable. The aforementioned screen tearing disappeared and the performance never really dipped. But I wanted to see how the card would hold up in even more modern games, so I tried out Beamng.Drive. Obviously, this wasn't going to run well in 1080p, and unfortunately, with the lowest settings in 720p, it got an average frame rate of only 13. What's interesting about this test is that the i3 was only at about 15% utilization. This is the hardest I've ever seen a graphics card bottleneck to 4130, and it goes to show just how useless the 6450 really is. It felt like I was playing the game in slow motion, but at the very least, the card stayed cool, and it never breached 64 degrees Celsius. Coincidentally, the rest of the games I played were also based around vehicles, with Dirt Rally being the next installment. The game is very well optimized, and you can push the settings extremely low to get it running on just about anything. I even turned off the cheering crowd that normally spawns, and with all these sacrifices in 1080p, it managed to get an average frame rate of 42 FPS. This card was heavily stressed in this benchmark, and both the VRAM and core were utilized to their maximum potential. But in the end, it ran great, so I can't really complain. Rocket League was the last game I was able to test, and it ended up killing the card. First, I threw on all the lowest settings with a 480p resolution, and the game looked so bad I can barely make out the ball. It got an average of 21 FPS with this configuration, and for some reason I decided to try it out in 1080p. This was a bad decision, and the frame rate fell to about 17 and the card didn't last long at all. After just a few minutes, the screen artifacted, the game crashed, and upon reset it did not display a picture. I went over to check out the card and it smelled horribly.
Guys, I don't know what the hell I just did, but this card fucking reeks. Something is wrong.
I didn't see any signs of damage on the PCB, but this effectively killed the card, and it hasn't worked since. Before it died, I also tried to run PUBG, but it didn't make it past the loading screen, and GTA 5 refused to run due to the lack of a compatible sound device. So, rest in peace to 6450. Leave an F in the comments to pay respects. In conclusion, this card is one of the worst I've seen in a while, and I just did a video on the 9500 GT. Its performance was horrible, but at least it didn't die. I mean, the 6450 was so bad, it's severely bottlenecked a 10-year-old i3. I often get comments stating that I should at least use an i7, but most of the cards I make a video on are undeserving of even being in such a system. Either way, it's clear that the best use case of a 6450 is to throw it into an e-waste dumpster. I mean, you could use it as intended as a display adapter, but for a little more money, you could also just get a GT 720. Yeah, that's how bad the card is. I'd recommend a 720 over a 6450. But considering the condition I got the 6450 in, it was probably glad to finally be put out of its misery. And I'm sure the overclocks were the final nail in the coffin. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video. Consider leaving a like or subscribing because it genuinely helps me out. If you want to join the community, there's a link to the official J-Knight Discord server in the description alongside a few donation methods that directly support the channel. If you have any questions or related comments, then leave them below and I'll be sure to respond to them. That's about it. Have a great day. Bye.